Hello, class. This lecture we will look at, let me back up one slide, Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, life apart from law. Now we can go to slide number 2. Look at verse 1. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm. Do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Look at the commentary. Jesus Christ has set us free. Therefore, Paul warns, stand firm. Standing firm is the theme of Paul's epistle. It was also the result of being justified by faith in Jesus Christ. Not only were the Galatians to stand in liberty that they have in Christ, but they were to shun legalism. So it poses this question: what is the effect of legalism? To be ensnared in a trap of legalistic Judaism, a religious system of do's and don'ts. To be under a yoke of bondage is servitude to the law. That's the effect of legalism. Verse 2, behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. Paul issues a strong warning to the Galatians who were considering submitting to the rite of circumcision. If they did and were thereby seeking righteousness by works, Paul declared, Christ will profit you nothing. Paul was strongly opposed to the Judaistic theology which insisted that circumcision was necessary to be saved. The act of circumcision will mean that they are trying to be saved by works and trying to be sanctified by works. Anyone who was circumcised for that reason added works to faith and demonstrated he had not exercised saving faith in Christ. It's saving faith is faith alone in Jesus Christ, and not anything added to it like having to be circumcised. Verse 3, and I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep all of the law, not just being circumcised. Turning to the law creates an entire new obligation. A person is obligated to obey all of it for your entire life. The law is a unit, and if a person puts himself under any part of it for justification, he is a debtor to the entire code with its requirements and its curse for your entire life. Believers are free from the condemnation of the law to those who disobey. Believers are free from the law as a means of justification. Believers are free from any obligation to keep the law to be justified. You have been saved, he says in verse 4. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace, or from the system of grace, which comes under Jesus Christ. Anyone seeking justification by means of keeping the law has been alienated from Jesus Christ. In addition, Paul states that they would have fallen away from the system of grace, which is opposed to the system of works. Paul is not referring to a possible loss of salvation when he says you've fallen from grace. Paul did not want them to fall from grace in their path to holiness and purity. That's sanctification. They were not only justified by grace, but they were also being sanctified by grace. Yes. And that comes by faith. You walk by faith. You live by faith. Paul feared that if the Galatians accepted circumcision, they would fall back into a system of works by way of the law. They will no longer be relying on the Spirit to live the spiritual life. We walk by faith, not by sight, and not by works. We walk by faith, and the works are the evidence of our faith, but not the cause of our sanctification. Verse 5, for we through the Spirit by faith are waiting for the hope of righteousness, he says. Righteousness comes by the Spirit and not the law. In contrast to legalists, true believers eagerly await the consummation of their salvation. Then the righteousness for which believers hope will be fully realized. Yeah, we'll have a resurrected body. At the coming of Christ, believers will be completely conformed to all the requirements of God's will. The inward and forensic righteousness which began at justification will be transformed into an outward righteousness at glorification, our glorified bodies. Verse 6. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love is what really is God's looking for. For those in the true sphere of salvation, neither circumcision nor the lack of it is of any significance. No one is saved just because he is circumcised. No one is condemned just because he is not circumcised. What matters is faith expressing itself through love. Faith that is genuine results in producing the spiritual fruit of love. That's what really matters. Verse 7, that's how we should be living our life. And if we do that, walk by faith, then spiritual fruit will be produced. You were running well, Paul says to those believers. Who hindered you from obeying the truth, he says. He knows it's the Judaizers. The Galatians had begun their marathon race well, but someone had cut in on them, causing them to break stride and stumble in their spiritual development, so they are not reaching spiritual maturity by walking by faith. Although many false teachers were disturbing the Galatians, the singular pronoun who indicates that it was the leader of the legalists. The result was that the believers were no longer obeying the truth, but were attempting to complete the race by legalistic self-effort rather than by faith. Verse 8. Turning to the law hinders the progress of spiritual maturity in the believer. Verse 8. This persuasion did not come from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. I have confidence in you in the Lord that you will adopt no other view, but the one who is disturbing you will bear his judgment, whoever he is. And we look at the commentary. This false teaching that the Galatians were beginning to embrace did not originate in the God who called them. Then Paul quotes a proverbial saying from the world of bread making. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. What's Paul's point? One apparently small deviation from the truth could destroy the entire system. If circumcision were made necessary for salvation, the whole grace system would fall. And basically the Judaizers say you got to become a Jew first before you can become a Christian. You got to be circumcised. However, Paul was optimistic that the Galatians would share his views and that the false teacher would suffer his due judgment. Verse 11, he writes, But I, brethren, Paul says, if I still preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? Then the stumbling block of the cross has been abolished. Apparently, Paul was charged with preaching circumcision. But Paul countered with a simple question. Why do I still suffer persecution then? That is by the Judaizers. If he preached the same message they did. If it were true that Paul had been preaching circumcision, but it was not, then the offense of the cross would have been ceased to exist in his ministry. Paul's point, the cross is a stumbling block because it marked the end of the law system. It ushered in grace which rendered circumcision and obedience to the Mosaic law unnecessary. Verse 12, I wish that those who are troubling you would even mutilate themselves. That sounds pretty drastic, Paul. Paul speaking out of a deep concern, and he's getting back to some very language much more stronger like he did in chapter 1. Speaking out of a deep concern for the gospel of the grace of God, Paul uttered a strong expression here. He wished that the Judaizers, who were so enthusiastic about circumcision, would go to the whole way themselves and cut everything off, because it would not do anything more than cutting off only the foreskin. Perhaps the resulting physical impotence pictured Paul's desire for the Judaizers to be unable to produce new converts. And that concludes this lecture. My sources, Donald Campbell, commentary on Galatians, in the Bible Knowledge Commentary, Timothy George, his commentary on Galatians in the New American Commentary, David Levy, his book Guarding the Gospel of Grace, and from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, his work, Faith Alone, the Condition of Our Salvation, an exposition of the book of Galatians. And that concludes this lecture.